I'm Bill Brown from Brookings Mountain West. Thank you for coming out tonight to our lecture. I was commenting from the back of the room that it looked like the audience was leaning to the right, but now when I get down here, I see we're leaning to the left. So I don't know what to make of that. You people in the center are okay, I guess. Thanks again for coming. We're going to talk about another very timely topic, the America's role in the changing global order. Of course, in the news quite a bit these days, with events happening and not happening in Russia and the Ukraine. I will announce that this is not specifically a lecture about Russia and the Ukraine, but about the larger global order. But that's obviously an important and current topic and fits into the larger presentation tonight. We're very pleased to have our colleague Bruce Jones out, who's, if I can use the word eminently, is eminently qualified to speak on this topic. So much so that we've started to wear him out, and I hope his voice can last through the lecture tonight. Bruce has been talking to UNLV graduate and undergraduate students, and other groups gave a talk to the World Affairs Council of Las Vegas last night. So we've tried to give him an introduction to the Las Vegas community. Bruce is a senior fellow at Brookings and also is director of the Managing Global Order project. And I apologize if you've heard this before, Bruce, but anybody who has the job title of Managing Global Order has both my admiration and my sympathy. But he's a very accomplished scholar. His PhD is from the London School of Economics. He has appointments at New York University and fellowships at Stanford, and is going to take his best shot at solving the problem of global order tonight, I think. Is that a fair description? Bruce.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me out here. It's a pleasure to be back in Las Vegas. I was here last year as well, and I found it very engaging to have the kinds of discussions out here about the United States and its role in the world. Bill mentioned that I run this program at Brookings called Managing Global Order. I introduced myself to one of Brookings' trustees just a few weeks ago. He asked what I did, and I said, I run this program called Managing Global Order. And he looked at me and he said, well, you're doing a very bad job. Right, so Bill's points are well taken. In fact, we just changed the name of the project to reflect this broader debate about America's role. So we're now calling it the Project on International Order and Strategy. I actually wanted to call it the Project on International Order and U.S. Strategy so that the acronym would be PIUS, but then I decided, no, that wasn't a good idea. There are a lot of events in the world that are occupying a lot of attention. Sometimes when you give talks on international order, American leadership, these kinds of issues, you have to start off by explaining why somebody should care about these questions. I think Mr. Putin has taken care of that problem for me for this week. I think we can see there are a lot of events, the crisis in the Ukraine, the situation in Venezuela, the situation in Syria. There are a number of different challenges that we confront on the international stage. Now, some of you may have been here a few weeks ago when my colleagues gave a talk on a similar topic of risks to the international order, a guy called Thomas Wright, who's a fellow also at Brookings. And he and I have a kind of running debate because he's the glass half full guy. He's the glass half empty guy, and I'm the glass half full guy. He's the pessimist, I'm the optimist. And I confess that this week is a tough week to be an optimist. I am reminded, there's an old Russian joke about the difference between pessimists and optimists, where a pessimist is somebody who looks out at the world, sees that everything is dark, and says, well, it can't possibly get any worse. And the optimist says, oh, yes, it can. Right? And I'm an optimist in both senses. I look around the world, I see issues of conflict, I see issues of competition, and I see important areas of cooperation. And part of what I'll do tonight is try to give a sense in different domains of different issue areas, different policy areas, the balance that we're seeing between cooperation and competition and conflict, and sort of what progress we're making or where we're seeing reversals. And there is some good news as well as some bad news. But I'm also an optimist in the Russian sense, in the recognition that things can get worse. And I think an extremely important issue to debate in the contemporary moment is what role the United States plays in the world system right now, and where it is that we confront very tough choices, I think, on the cusp between things that are dangerous but could get a lot worse. And our policy actions will have a substantial role in shaping those outcomes. I gave a similar talk to a number of students earlier today. None of them were alive during the Cold War. I was. I look out at the audience, I suspect a lot of you were, and you remember that there is a difference between the times we've been in now and some past times, and things can get worse, so I'll talk a certain amount about that. When we talk about international order, and we talk a lot about U.S. leadership in the international order and U.S. standing in the world, it tends to be without a lot of specificity about what the international order is or what it does or what that term means. And one of the things that I think is useful is to disentangle different components of the international order. What does it mean to have an international order? What are the functions of order? And what role does the United States play in those? And I think of there being 5 major domains of international order, or at least I would articulate it in those terms. And I'll just articulate them briefly and then spend some time talking about where we stand on each of them. The first and the kind of essential issue of international order is avoiding great power war. And that's been the preoccupation of American foreign policy for time immemorial, or to put it more positively, to sustain a peace between the great powers. That's the classic definition of international order. And one of the questions we'll come to is whether we're seeing new risks of direct confrontation or war between the great powers in the international system. We've been for 25 years in a period since the end of the Cold War where the United States was unquestionably the dominant power and no real risks of great power war. So a question mark is whether that's changing. The second critical function of international order is maintaining global prosperity, maintaining the systems for free trade, for global finance, for global growth. And that's a kind of major function the United States has played in the post-war era, backing the global financial system through the role of the dollar, backing global trade, bringing other countries into the global trade system. We've seen extraordinary expansion of global trade and global finance for the past 20 years. And then I'll look at the question of where we stand on that. And this question of whether or not the rising powers, China, Brazil, India, et cetera, are challenging that order or supporting it and what's going on there. The third function of order is more, I would say, so let me just pause and say, those 2 functions of order are essentially undebated, right? Russia, China, India, Japan, the Europeans, et cetera, all accept that the functions of order are to avoid great power war and to maintain open international economic systems and global prosperity. A third function of order is much more debated. And in American foreign policy, the concept of the international order, the concept of American leadership in the world has been around spread of democracy, defense of human rights, spread of freedom. There have been periods in American history where those have been rhetorical aspirations very much violated by our own policy. There have been periods when we've backed those aspirations by power. There are periods where we've been in a deep debate about whether or not the United States should be in the role of using its various forms of power to advance democracy or advance freedoms or advance human rights. But whatever you think within the American debate, it's certainly not a consensus issue internationally. And it's not just that other non-democracies don't believe that international order should be about the pursuit of democracy or the defense of democracy. There are also real debates with other democracies. The European Union, the Europeans, for example, will talk a lot more about defense of human rights than defense of democracy. India, Brazil, important democracies, now much more influential in the world stage, absolutely resist the notion that there should be any role in the international system of spreading democracy in that sense. They're happy to nurture a democracy which grows up organically, but they resist the notion that there should be a democratic divide in the international system or that power should be used to foster democracy. So that's a major debate in the international system. If we were having this conversation 30 years ago, that would have been the end of the conversation. Those would have been the 3 things that we discussed in international order terms. Over the past 25 years, we've added an important additional function of international order, in my view, which is the response to civil wars and the effort to try to deal with civil wars, to reduce the level of civil wars, to reduce the suffering of civil wars, and to deal with the humanitarian consequences of civil wars. That was not something we did during the Cold War. Right? During the Cold War, we either ignored civil wars or we played into them. A lot of them were proxy wars. We backed one side, the Soviet backed another, we gave them money and weapons and let them fight to whoever could win, and we would then back that government. These were nasty, brutal, tons of people were killed, millions of people were killed in those civil wars. Since the end of the Cold War, with some exceptions, we've taken a different stance of looking at civil wars as a problem that can be tackled through mediation and peacekeeping and post-conflict reconstruction and humanitarian assistance, and that's an ongoing function. Some civil wars threaten broader problems of international orders, some do not. Nevertheless, we have now in the international system these very robust mechanisms, mostly based through the UN, the EU, NATO, and others, for trying to deal with civil wars. And I'll talk a little bit about where we are on that and what the future of that might be. And then last, I think it is fair to say that if we look out over the next 20 to 30 years from where we are now, that if we're going to be talking about a stable international system, if we're going to be talking about the changing role of the United States, of new powers in the international system, we can't avoid talking about energy and climate change. These are critical issues for ourselves. These are critical issues for the rising powers, for India, for China, a huge explosive demand in energy growth, and real consequences in terms of how we're going to grapple with the question of climate change. And I think whereas traditionally climate change is not treated as a feature of international order, as a topic of international order, and certainly has not been a topic of American leadership, I think if we're going to think about American leadership in the international order in the coming 30 years, energy and climate change have to be important issues. So where do we stand on this? We just published a report, you can look at it at Brookings, on the state of the international order, and we reached a kind of glass half full, glass half empty judgment. But it wasn't we thought, oh, there are 2 or 3 issues where everything is going well, and 2 or 3 issues where everything is going badly. It's like in every one of these issues, there are good things and there are bad things happening in the international system. And let me try to walk through some of that. And I'll do it in reverse order because I want to end on this question of great power tensions and the risk of great power conflict. So let me start with energy and climate change. And here we're watching just phenomenal transformations in the international system. Okay? I think of it as 2 revolutions that have already occurred and a 3rd revolution that we need to occur but that hasn't yet. The first revolution is a demand revolution. A supply revolution. Just an astonishing growth in the supply of fossil fuels as a function of the shale revolution and the tidal oil revolution, primarily in the United States and now spreading to other regions. A technological revolution and a market revolution which has dramatically expanded the availability of oil and gas to international markets and primarily from the US supply. By 2015, the United States will overtake Saudi Arabia and Russia as the largest oil producers in the world. By 2020, we will be the largest energy producer in the world, a position we had in the 1930s, lost, and are about to regain. It's an astonishing transformation. And one that I think in many ways strengthens America's hand in the world, but is a complicated tool to use. Just ask Mr. Putin how complicated it is to use energy as an instrument of power. Okay? The second revolution in energy is a demand revolution. We've seen just skyrocketing demand for energy in China, in India, and all of the emerging powers, and kind of this huge new demand for energy in these rapidly growing economies. And it's producing huge shifts in the flow of energy. In the past, the primary channel, in a sense, if you could think of that, was a flow of energy from the Arab world to the EU and to the United States. And that's changing. Energy growth is pretty static in the EU and declining in the United States. We're producing a lot more domestically, and oil and gas are now flowing from the Middle East to Asia. But a really important thing to talk about is, one of the things you'll hear a lot these days is, well, given that we no longer import any oil from Saudi Arabia, why should we care what happens in the Middle East? Well, first of all, Saudi Arabia is still our number 3 source of imports for oil. I'm sorry, our number 2 source of imports for oil. So it's just not true that we're not importing any Saudi oil. We're producing a lot domestically. We still import Saudi oil. But even if we get to a point where we're not importing a single drop of Saudi oil, the fact of the matter is the way the global oil markets work is it's a global price for oil. And if Saudi oil is interrupted, or if there's a kind of challenge, political crisis in Saudi Arabia and they stop producing the oil at the rate that they're producing it, the global price of oil will skyrocket, and that will impact on our economy in a very direct way. There is no distraction from the global price of oil just because we don't import Middle East oil. We're still tightly bound up into a global oil market, irrespective of what the flow of oil is. There's something of a security in producing domestically and a lot of flow from our own neighborhood, from Canada, from Venezuela, from Brazil. But then again, look at the political turmoil in Venezuela, which could interrupt flows again. All right? So we're still tightly bound up in global oil markets, even if we're no longer importing Middle East oil. And when it comes to climate change, various of you will have your own views about how important a topic this is. But I think we can say the following things with some. Right now, if you look at total energy consumption, about 80% of it is fossil fuel based, oil, gas, coal. Okay? Then you see pretty substantial investments in solar technology and nuclear technology and renewables in the United States, in China, in various markets. China's really leading on nuclear, bring down the price of nuclear energy. We're both acting on solar. India is really leading on distributed energy. We're seeing large-scale investments in these non-carbon-based energy forms. But we're also seeing huge continued growth. And when the International Energy Agency, which is the most respectable agency that does energy data, when it projects outwards and it looks at 2035, we're at 80% right now fossil fuels in terms of energy consumption. We're seeing all this investment in green tech. We're also seeing all this growth, and when it predicts for 2035, it estimates that the total amount of carbon-based fuels in the energy mix will be 80%. Okay? So we're just not making headway relative to demand growth on energy. And we're big factors in this. We're by far and away the largest the largest carbon emitter, and our per capita carbon emissions vastly larger than anybody else's. They're beginning to come down, and they'll come down more rapidly in the next few years as a result of some regulatory changes. China is rapidly growing its emissions. It's already overtaken the United States in total emissions, but remember that its per capita emissions are much smaller. They're about the size of Europe's now, its per capita emissions. And people tend to, when we think about climate change, we tend to think about the United States, we tend to think about China, but over the next decade or so, the next 2 decades, we also have to think about India. India is growing rapidly. It has a huge population, and it needs to substantially increase its energy consumption. And at current pace, it's going to reach or meet the EU. So left to its own devices and left to the kind of current system, we'll be adding an entire another European Union to the carbon mix over the next 30 years. Now, then think about this in sort of justice terms or international order terms. We could try to say, well, look, we really have to, for climate reasons, in order to stay below the 2-degree threshold, we really have to push hard on restricting fossil fuel use. India has 600 million poor people. 400 million of them have no access to modern energy. So are we going to turn around and say, sorry, India, you don't get to grow, you don't get to move your poor people into the middle classes by using energy? Yeah, I'm sorry we screwed up the climate for you, but that's tough. That's a pretty tough stance to take. On the other hand, India and China are both confronting major problems of pollution. It's a huge source of concern for both countries. And they recognize that there's no way around this problem. They have to work with the West to try to tackle carbon-based energy and the climate change issue. The most optimistic thing I could say here is that we're beginning to see, I think we're at the very beginnings of the very beginnings of a serious conversation between the United States and China on the one hand, the United States and India on the other, about driving towards a more effective regime for moving towards efficiency and renewables and gas as a cleaner mix than what we are now. But you know, I think on this one I'm more on the glass half empty than the glass half full side on climate change. On energy as a matter of economy, as a matter of power, I'm very much on the glass half full side. The other issue that I talked about was response to civil wars. Before Ukraine took over the news, a lot of the news on this was on Syria, right? And so the story there is the United States and Russia deadlocked in the Council, UN feckless and irrelevant, can't respond to civil wars, etc. There have always been episodes, since the end of the Cold War, there have always been episodes where the United States and Russia or the United States and some other actor have been deadlocked in the Council. Kosovo was another one, Bosnia for a while. But the fact of the matter is, for every Syria out there, there's about a dozen other cases where the UN or the EU or somebody else is acting to respond to civil wars. In Mali, in the Congo, in Somalia, Sudan, on and on, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone, etc. Peacekeeping fails at roughly 50% rate. Okay, about half the time we try a peacekeeping operation, it fails. But remember that during the Cold War, we didn't try it at all. We just let these things burn out or we fueled them. And so a 50% rate, failure rate is also a 50% success rate. And what's happened to civil wars over the past 25 years is this. It's just been a steady and sustained decline in the number and the level of civil wars in the world. And if you looked at death tolls from civil wars, they've declined even more sharply. Syria is obviously a major exception. But if you look globally, in every region of the world, you're seeing this steady decline in the number and level of civil wars. With one exception, which is the Middle East, where we've seen an uptick, and an important uptick in the number of civil wars, and of course with Syria, a dramatic uptick in terms of death tolls. Okay? But dealing with these questions has become an important part of the international order. We've also seen dramatic declines in the level of poverty in the world, huge reductions in poverty. Okay? I was looking at this graphic again, and I don't like this graphic. Those look like they're almost steady state lines. In fact, if you read the numbers carefully, what you're seeing there is 1 billion people being pulled out of poverty over the past 20 years. All right? 1 billion people. And that's largely a function of economic growth in China, in India, Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, a number of other places. In fact, for much of this period of time, every country in the world that wasn't in war was growing. And we've seen these huge movements in terms of pulling people out of poverty as a consequence. That's partly a story about international cooperation and aid, and et cetera, but it's more a story of the phenomenal growth of the emerging powers and what they've done to reduce poverty in their own countries and the markets that they've created. Now, unsurprisingly, to move to the third issue I talked about, which is democracy. In a way, unsurprisingly, if we've seen this huge global growth, reduction in poverty, and reduction in war, sorry, I'm going to back up 1 second. Reductions in poverty, but we're also seeing there are also huge population growth rates in a lot of the world's poorest countries. So you take Nigeria, right? Growing very fast. It's also on track to overtake the United States in size of population by 2040. It's a huge growing economy, but it's also a huge growing population. And the question of whether or not the rate of growth will keep up with the population growth, and a lot of this is young population, all right? So you have a huge numbers of people entering the workforce, and a real question mark about whether there are going to be enough jobs for young people. South Africa, which has similar numbers, has a 60% youth unemployment rate right now, which is just stunning. I mean, Spain has that right now, but that's a result of a very acute crisis. In South Africa, it's kind of structurally, they have 60% unemployment. So you have major poverty reduction and growth in the developing countries, but a kind of shadow over the horizon about whether or not that can keep up with population growth. The third thing I talked about was the spread of democracy. And what we saw over the post-Cold War period was a fairly sustained growth in the number of democracies in the world, in virtually every region of the world. In Latin America and Africa and Asia, we saw an increasing number of democracies in the world. Every region but one, again, the Middle East. That rate of progress has stalled. And a big question mark is what's going to be the consequence, or what's going to be the end result of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, obviously, we saw a series of democratic challenges to a series of authoritarian regimes in Tunisia, in Yemen, in Egypt, in Syria. We've also seen, as we know, dramatic crackdowns, extremely violent and brutal crackdown in Syria, which has also then resulted in a multifaceted internal and regional war. A crackdown in Egypt, we saw these kind of huge swings, elections, Muslim Brotherhood to power, very violent reaction to that, army back in power now. Revolution theory tells us that the average revolution takes about 15 years to settle down into some sort of predictable outcome. So we don't know yet what the outcomes of the revolutions and the kind of turmoil in the Arab Spring will be. But there's no guarantee that they're going to be peaceful and democratic at the end of the day. It is worth noticing that at the same time as we've seen this kind of growth, reduction in poverty, and spread of democracy, we've also seen the following. This is a chart that just shows access to the internet and cell phone use. 20 years ago, there were 30 million cell phones in use in Africa. Today, there are 400 million cell phones in use in Africa. We've seen similar explosions in the number of cell phones in the Middle East and virtually every region of the world. I don't think there's any real question that this was part of the phenomenon in Egypt and Tunis. People being able to communicate with each other, get access to news that was not controlled by state media, organized around electronic media. But whether or not that results in positive changes or not, we don't know yet. A lot of people refer to this as liberation technology, and I think there's some truth to that. But we don't know yet what the long-term consequences of this will be. But it is a striking phenomenon, and combined with sort of this, the youth surge that we see in a lot of countries, this is changing the context in a lot of places. Fourth issue, or I mean, if I'm going backwards now, so the kind of the fourth issue I'll talk about, the second function I talked about is sustaining global stability, global prosperity, the global financial system and global trade. And here we've seen really important changes in the global economy. Essentially this just explosive growth in Russia, India, China, and Brazil, okay, the BRICS countries. And we hear a lot about the BRICS, which collectively are about to catch up to the United States, right? One of the things that's striking about that is how have they done so? They have done so essentially by entering into the global trading system and the global finance system. 56% of China's economy is dependent on global trade right now. Roughly the same numbers in India. It's by participating in the global system that they've been able to transform their own economies, producing massive quantities of goods that they sell primarily to the West. So there's just a huge change in the global economy. You see this graphic a lot as a depiction of the redistribution of power. In my mind, it's a categorical error. We take all the emerging powers together and we say, how are they looking? And we take the United States by itself. A different way of thinking about it is to take the United States and its allies and look at the BRICS, or to think about the West and look at the BRICS. And the West still has the preponderant share of the global economy. It's still 70% of the global economy. And we sometimes forget that when we get obsessed by the BRICS. It's also fair to say that I think every one of the BRICS is now in substantial trouble economically. Indian growth has slowed dramatically. Brazilian growth has slowed dramatically. Chinese growth hasn't slowed yet, but it's pumping debt into its economy in order to sustain its growth rates. 5 years ago, when it would pump $1 of debt into its economy, it would generate $1 of GDP growth. Now it has to pump $4 of debt into the economy to generate $1 of GDP growth. It has a 240% debt load, a debt to GDP load. There's a very good economist called Rishi Sharma, who's the head of emerging markets at Morgan Stanley. And he did a comprehensive study looking back on every economy that's experienced the kinds of growth rates that China has and the debt loads that China has. There have been about 80 of them over the past 70 years. Of the 80 experienced a dramatic slowdown in growth or a financial crisis when they exceeded about 150% debt to GDP ratios. It's just not sustainable. Now, whether China will have a gradual slowdown to sort of 4 to 5% growth rates or a sharper slowdown remains to be seen, but all of the BRICS are in some difficulty. So I think we'll see for a long period of time the United States and the West still having a very large role in the global economy, but the BRICS are also important factors in the global economy as well. And the important thing to recognize here is, if we think about the period since the global financial crisis, okay, the most acute crisis in the financial system, the global system since the Great Depression, right? You could have imagined historically a country like China, which is rising rapidly, or a country like India, who have not had a seat at the table in the global financial system, who have not been part of the kind of infrastructure of power, seeing it as a moment to challenge the United States, or to break the international system, or to kind of call for new rules and to kind of reorganize the international. It's exactly the opposite that happened. What we saw was a US-led response. The Europeans participated in, the Japanese participated in, the Indians participated in, the Chinese participated in, the Brazilians participated in, to solve the global financial crisis and get back to global growth. And we've seen that when push comes to shove, the common interest between the United States, the West, and the rising powers in terms of sustaining global financial systems, sustaining global trade, avoiding protectionism, have been pretty robust. And actually, if you want a really good news story about the international order, it's this, right? The global financial crisis could have easily moved us into a global depression, could easily have triggered a major protectionist round, and we've avoided both of those outcomes and actually returned relatively quickly to fairly stable growth in the international system and in the United States. We've also seen a huge change in trading patterns. This is just a simple graphic that shows the rise in trade within Asia. The reason I put it up is just to make the transition to the last point. Classic liberal theory tells you that when two nations trade with one another, they don't go to war with one another, all right? So if you see a rise in trade in Asia, you would expect to see a demilitarization of relationships. You'd expect to see declining defense spending, et cetera. We're seeing the opposite. We're seeing huge spikes in defense spending in Asia, right? China leading the pack, but Japan and India and others, and Russia as well. I guess Russia got dropped off that, but it's also hugely recovering its defense spending. We're seeing a rapid militarization of relations in Asia, okay? So despite the trade, despite the shared interests in global growth, we're seeing a rapid militarization of relations in Asia. And so that takes me to my last point, but I don't have a slide for this. Is it weird if the screen is blank? Do I need to put something up there? No, fine. This key question about whether or not we're going to see stable relations between the great powers or whether we risk seeing war and conflict between the great powers. There is a narrative out there about American decline. There's a narrative out there about the rise of great powers. Okay? I think the narrative of American decline is vastly oversold. The United States remains by far and away the largest economy and by far and away the most influential economy, the dominant military power. I can go on and on and on. But just one level below the United States, you have a whole series of countries, China, Japan, Russia, the European Union, et cetera, who are struggling for position, it seems to me. We are in what was often described as a multipolar system at the level below the United States. Okay? It's a very strange historical moment. Historically, the narrative here is that when a power is rising, a power like China, let's say, a power is rising, there will be a temptation, a two-part temptation. The top power will be tempted to use its currently dominant position to squelch the rising power, to forestall a challenge, right? So you'll often see dominant powers going to war with rising powers to forestall the risk that they pose or the challenge that they pose. Alternatively, you can see the rising power challenging the top power for dominance, and great power wars often come out of either one of those two dynamics. When it's the latter dynamic, when it's the rising power challenging the top power, one of the obvious strategies is to accumulate allies. If you have a top power, there are going to be lesser powers who are dissatisfied and who are resentful of the top power, and the rising power will accumulate allies as a way of bolstering its own capabilities towards going after the top power. Well, let's look at the situation. Let's look at China's allies. North Korea, good luck with that. Pakistan, which weirdly is also our ally, kind of totally bizarre situation. Cambodia, 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 and Cambodia. Okay? China doesn't have allies in any meaningful sense of the term. Let's look at our allies. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, Australia, Spain, the Netherlands, on and on and on. We have 45 formal allies and a whole series of other informal allies. And our allies are not small countries looking for us to defend them. There are 15 of the top 20 economies in the world. And if you look at countries like India and Brazil, well, they're not allies, but we have a defense agreement with Brazil. We sell it weapons, they sell us weapons. We're not allies with India, but if you ask the Indians what's the greatest threat to them, they'll point north to China. And there's the beginnings of real exploration of joint defense production between the United States and India. Right? So we're just not seeing the phenomenon of smaller countries banding around China to challenge us. In fact, we have a ton of allies, and these other actors in the international system, Brazil and India, they're playing a kind of complicated game. It's a very tricky situation for them. They have huge trade relations with China that they have to maintain. But on the other hand, in strategic terms, they're getting closer to us. Okay? But I think there are nevertheless real risks here in great power terms, including for the United States. And the basic pattern that I see is, and we've seen this historically as well, that it's not always the case that it's the rising power challenging the top power that's the dynamic in question. In fact, the biggest risk historically has been the number 2 and the number 3 power going to war with each other, right? Or other powers at that second tier competing for influence. And I'm going to conclude by just pointing to 2 situations, which I think are similar in structure, although they're very different in their specificities, and both pose just, I think, acutely difficult challenges for the United States. And I think we're going to be facing these kinds of challenges for a long time. And the 2 situations I'm thinking are of China-Japan relations in the East China Sea and the tensions between the EU and Russia in the Ukraine, right? And I think in both cases what we're seeing is these competing powers, both at that kind of second tier, competing for influence and competing for resources, competing in a variety of ways that risk pulling in the United States. In the East China Sea, I don't know how much you've followed this, but you have these islands that are about that big. The Japanese call those some senkakus, the Chinese call them the Diaoyu Islands. They're tiny little islands. They are in the middle of a fairly substantial sea under which there are substantial oil resources. And I think that's part of the dynamic, is both Japan and China are interested in developing those resources. But there's also a very powerful militarization dynamic here, a very powerful nationalist dynamic here. A lot of pressure in the Chinese army to slap back at the Japanese for past crimes, for historical crimes, as put in Chinese terms. A lot of pressure in Japan to bolster itself, to exit from what's called the lost decade, as it was sort of slumped in low growth, to reboost its military capabilities, growing its military spending very rapidly. A lot of near misses. We've seen already several near misses between naval boats or Coast Guard ships around these islands, or airplanes. A couple of instances where a Chinese jet has locked radar on a Japanese or vice versa. A very dangerous situation. And of course, Japan is a treaty ally. And the treaty alliance we have with Japan says that if Japanese territory or Japanese administered territory, which the senkakus are, come under attack, we're obligated to go to Japan's defense. So let's look at the choice we confront. Let's say that the Chinese leadership decides to move this way, or much more realistically, the Chinese leadership doesn't decide to move this way, but some naval captain, some Coast Guard captain, ends up in intense confrontation with their counterpart, Chinese or Japanese, and one side shoots at the other. It doesn't really matter which one, and it rapidly escalates and becomes a militarized conflict between these two actors. So let's look at our choices. Do we go to war with China over an island this big? That's a bad choice. Do we abandon Japan and our alliance structures and cast huge doubt with the rest of our allies about the viability of our defense? That's a bad choice. But that's exactly the choice we could confront. So right now, a lot of American foreign policy is going into avoiding a confrontation between China and Japan, reducing the risks of accidents, reducing the tensions, et cetera. But it's going to be very hard to avoid that scenario. And we'll be faced with an incredibly tough choice there about how to act in those terms. And I think we can think in similar terms about the Ukraine. You know, the Russians were making a power play in Ukraine, clamping down on gas sales to Ukraine, emphasizing the $15 billion debt that Ukraine owes to Russia and offering to pay it off if the Ukraine would abandon its talks with trade with the EU and really side with the Russians. It made a major power play. That backfired. We saw the kind of demonstrations in the street in western Ukraine. The EU's moved in. They've offered to pay the fine, overthrow the government. Yankovic has fled to Russia. And now, of course, Russia has moved in militarily to occupy Crimea, which is also about that big and has an important Russian naval base. So now we could easily confront a similar choice. So we're going to go to war with Russia over the defense of Crimea. It's a bad choice. Or are we going to say it's fine for Putin to take over chunks of Eastern Europe and not come to the defense of the EU and not come to the defense of our NATO allies and other parts of Eastern Europe? That's a pretty bad choice. So it seems to me that the biggest risk we confront in the international system is not that the emerging powers are going to challenge us. It's not that we're declining. It's not, and the rhetoric around this stuff, it seems to me quite wrong. We're in a very strong position in sort of empirical terms, but we have this underlying risks in the great power relations at one level below us that could pull us into very dangerous confrontations. And I would say, by the way, if that happens, then we're going to see serious risks to all the other issues that I talked about. Serious risks to democracy, serious risks to the economy. It's going to be much harder to maintain cooperation in the Security Council and elsewhere to deal with civil war, much harder to deal with eradication of poverty. So there's a huge amount at stake. American power is still vastly the most consequential factor in this, but in an extremely complicated situation. So on that not so positive note, I think I'm going to end and we can open up to questions and discussions.
Thanks, Bruce. I am guessing we might have just a few questions from this crowd. Anybody want to get us started? And sir?
What do you think the role of the Muslim countries stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific will be in the world in the future, considering the Sunni-Shia conflicts within all of these different countries?
Okay. Do you want us to do one-on-one, or do you want to collect a few, or how do you want to do things?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. It's a really important question. It's an important issue. I think it's fair to say that first of all, let's start off by being clear that there are quite a lot of different kinds of Muslim countries, right? Muslim majority countries. And Indonesia, often Asia's Muslim majority country, and that's not implicated by the same kinds of dynamics that we're seeing in the Middle East. The largest majority population in the world is in India. So let's separate it a little bit from Muslim per se, but the kind of Sunni-Shia dynamic you're talking about is very important. This is a real challenge here. I think what we're seeing in the Arab world is that we've had a system where essentially Sunni authoritarian regimes were squelching internal dissent and internal democratic protest. Okay? By the way, they were our allies, and we paid them to do that. All right? That became unsustainable for the kinds of reasons we've talked about, and we've seen this kind of challenge to the Sunni autocratic regimes. We see once that system is removed that there's an awful lot of turmoil within, and the best organized forces so far have been Muslim Brotherhood organized forces and posed a challenge to the regimes. Add into that a Sunni-Shia divide in the Arab world, and you see very dangerous games with the Qataris, for example, which is a Shia state backing the Muslim Brotherhood as a source of pressure on the Saudis, and very complicated games. Add to that the question of Iran, all right, and a Persian-Arab split. Whether this descends into a kind of all-out regional war, I don't know, right? I mean, I think there are serious risks here. If we look at the way Syria is spilling out into Iraq, the flow of al-Qaeda into Syria, there's a real risk of a kind of contagion effect across the region. And then there's a real debate here, and I'm not going to try to answer it, a real debate here about what stakes the United States in this and whether or not we have vital interests at play or humanitarian interests. I mean, clearly we have humanitarian interests at play. 300,000 people killed in Syria, or approaching that number, the largest refugee crisis in the world. On the other hand, are we going to intervene in Syria? On whose side? On al-Qaeda's side? Against Iran? It's a kind of incredibly complicated play. And where this will get incredibly difficult for us, if it isn't difficult enough already, is if that issue, in the terms that is happening in the sort of the Levant, hits the Gulf. Right? Saudi, Bahrain, we have a huge base in Bahrain. It's pretty vital to our interests in terms of the flow of oil out of Hormuz, not just our interests, but everybody else's. And of course Saudi Arabia, which is still the dominant energy producer in the global price. Both Sunni-dominated autocracies, both continue to suppress internal dissent, and I don't know how sustainable that is. And that'll be an explosive situation if we get there. The one bright side in this, it seems to me, is the U.S. negotiations with Iran, if they succeed. But it's a big if. This is an incredibly difficult regime. Frankly, our politics in Iran are pretty damn difficult too. And the odds of actually working both of those politics at the same time and getting to a deal are very slim, it seems to me. And one of the things that we know about conflict issues is that the most dangerous time in any conflict is when there's been a genuine negotiation and it fails. Because what happens is both sides reach the conclusion that there's no possibility of a negotiated settlement, and therefore the recourse to war becomes more likely. And I think the risks of military confrontation between the United States and Iran remain very real. And of course the Saudis are desperate for us to do it and pushing us actively to do it. So a very complicated issue.
Sir?
With regard to Ukraine being a former Soviet republic and within Russia's sphere of influence, there seems to be a more dramatic pushback by Russia because of that. Why do you think they didn't react that way with regard to Poland and Romania and Hungary, which are also in their sphere of influence?
Because it happened when they were weaker. If you look at the Soviet Union and what happened to the Soviet Union at the end of the Soviet Union, I mean, I don't think you've ever seen in history a major power collapse so entirely. You look at the Soviet economy in 1990 and it's 10% of what it was at the peak of the Soviet Union. It's astonishing. They've lost half their population and a third of their territory, right? So the scale and the power of the Soviet Union dramatically constricts. And that's the moment at which NATO expands into Poland and kind of all that stuff happens. And I mean, they didn't like it in the slightest, but they had no capacity to do anything about it. We've seen the Russian economy rebound. We've seen the Russian military rebuilt to some degree. We have very assertive leadership. That being said, I think we should be careful not to overestimate how strong Russia is. It is a one-note economy. It's an oil and gas economy. Its economy in the oil and gas sector are totally dependent on Western technology and Western investment. And in my mind, the way Russia has played this game is going to rebound very much to their disadvantage over time. We're already seeing the ruble has declined dramatically. They lost $60 billion in the stock market yesterday. You see investors pulling out of the oil and gas sector. I think this is going to be terrible for the Russian economy. Pretty bad for Ukraine too, but terrible for the Russian economy. And I think you're already seeing Putin coming under substantial pressure from the oligarchs around him who only survive if the oil and gas sector is booming. So they just didn't have the capabilities to do it in the earlier phase, and they're going to try now.
Thank you.
In the back, sir, and then I'll get down here.
6 years ago, Russia did the same thing with Georgia.
Right.
And they've still got troops in Georgia. It doesn't seem like it really hurt them that much. How's the Ukraine different?
Yeah. It hurt them economically. It did not hurt them militarily. And I think, if you ask me, are we going to see Russian troops in the Crimea 6 years from now? My guess would be yes. I don't see it being likely that we're going to convince Putin to pull his troops out of Crimea. He has an important base there. He's not going anywhere. Now, you can read that in two ways. You can say, how bad is it that the West allows Russia to move into the Crimea? You could also say what happened last week was Russia just lost the Ukraine and held on to Crimea. It's a pretty big loss for Russia. So you're right, nobody's going to be forcing Russian troops out of the Ukraine, out of the Crimea. But I don't think that it's the case that there are no consequences for Russia here. I think there are substantial consequences. It also alienated Turks, Kazakhs, Belarusians, Europeans, Americans. I'm not sure how badly he's alienated the Chinese, but it hasn't helped them. So I think there are real costs, but we're likely to see Russian troops in the Crimea for a long time to come.
Sir?
Yeah, I appreciate the comments about the economic aspects and certainly the growth and improvement in trade, which is really wonderful. And I certainly would like to see that. We can do clean energy growth to help it further. But I guess there again, it has to do with some of the imbalances that continue to arise. You know, we have a 4% trade deficit. China has a double-digit surplus. Europe, north and south, is that way too. Germany has the surplus, the others have the deficit. So is there some way, certainly we want the growth and the interdependence, but to guide it
Yeah.
toward a more balanced outcome?
It's a very tough problem, right? And we simply are not used to this. We are simply not used to a system in which our growth is dependent on China's growth and vice versa, and this kind of business of trying to negotiate these balances. I mean, in the past, we ran a balance if we wanted to run a balance, or if our economy was working that way. It was not something we negotiated with anybody else. And we're now in a situation, primarily through the G20, where we are trying to actually have this dialogue about whether, okay, look, China, we really need you to stimulate domestic demand, to reduce it, et cetera. One thing I would say about it, which, you know, I've always tried to find the silver lining here. I hear a lot about this, and people will talk to me about, oh, the kind of Chinese surpluses. Germany's surpluses are far larger. Its financial surpluses are far larger, right? So if you'll hear a lot of people in Congress talking about, the Chinese. It's like, well, one of our closest allies has substantially larger surpluses. So let's not paint this in a China versus U.S. Terms. This is a complex global economy, and we all have to try to find ways to navigate this. I did notice, by the way, I talked about 5 issues. My PowerPoint talks about 6 tests of international order. So clearly, I'm not really the right person to answer the economic questions, since I can't even count between 5 and 6. But I do notice the kind of political character of this debate, which seems miscast to me, a kind of U.S. versus China, when in fact it's a much more complicated game and a more positive game in those terms.
We'll give you a discount on your tickets. Because of that. Yes, sir.
Kind of related to that, I noticed on the GDP graph, like 08 and 09, obviously there was a dip between the BRICS and I guess, was it us or the Western, or the
everybody.
United States? And theirs was kind of flat and it almost increased still slightly, and ours actually went down. Is that a result of maybe they have better ways of growing, or maybe we're just like plugged in to more or have more to lose?
We contracted a lot sharper. They contracted too. They just rebounded faster. But part of the way they rebounded was by pumping debt into their own economy. All right, so they stimulated it at a faster rate than we did, and now they're seeing the consequences of that. So, you know, in a way, you could argue we took a deeper contraction. We didn't stimulate that rapidly. We stimulated to a certain extent, and we've returned to relatively stable growth. They contracted sharply, pumped in massive quantities of debt, returned to fast growth quickly, but are now facing real constraints, and their growth is slowing a lot. So it's more a question of the sequencing of when they grew. I think part of the challenge for China, for Brazil, for India, they've become, the regimes have become the governments have become extremely dependent on fast growth as a way of managing their internal political situation. For China in particular, it kind of cast itself as saying its legitimacy is bound up in producing 8 to 9% growth rates. And one of the reasons I think you're seeing this incredible pumping of debt into the economy to sustain the growth rates is to deal with that political challenge. It's a lot more difficult to deal with the kind of reforms that China needs to make, that India needs to make, if you're growing more slowly. When you have to change things, you have to change labor markets, you have to revise the rules of the game. It's a lot easier to do that if you're growing rapidly. There's more of a pie to spread around, a lot tougher to do it. But all of them confront, there's a term in economics called middle income transition. Take your economy from $1,000 a year to $4,000 a year per capita GDP is actually relatively easy if you have good policy. You produce cheap stuff and you sell it to the West, right? That's what China's done, what India's done, whatever else has done. The next phase of growth requires domestic innovation, high-tech innovation, structural reforms, anti-corruption measures, much, much, much tougher. And the majority of countries that attempt that transition fail. I'm not saying that China will fail. I'm actually fairly bullish on China over the long term, but it's going to be an extremely tough transition.
Ma'am?
For years, the UN and other and NGOs were working on population control. Excuse me. But you showed the graphs of the population increasing so quickly. Is that because they've stopped doing that, or because of better health outcomes?
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon. Basically what you see, I'm not an expert in this, but basically what you see is that population control is essentially a function of reaching middle class income, right? Poor people have a lot of children, middle income people have less children. And everywhere we've seen this happen, it's the same pattern, except for China, where you have a one-child policy, right?
In these countries?
You get healthier, you get less economically dependent on your, the kind of psychological factor of, well, I have a job but I'm sort of barely scraping by, but if I have 5 kids and they all have a job and 3 of them will survive, right? So there's a kind of psychological factor and a survival factor. The incentives for that change, and you see, and to be honest with you, I don't think that the kind of population control measures by the UN or NGOs are actually particularly influential in this. There's a kind of dynamic that happens as states meet middle income standards where population growth rates just taper off. The challenge for Ethiopia and Nigeria in these countries is they have a long way to go before they meet those kinds of levels, right? So that you can still see huge population growth before you start to see the taper off that you're likely to see. And by the time you've done that, you're already, in Nigeria's case, you're at 400 million people. It's pretty substantial.
Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, sir.
There is a current of thought that the United States is withdrawing internationally, and particularly pointing to evidently a fear on the part of some of these allies that we will not be there.
Right.
And I relate that to what seems to be a failed effort on the trade treaty in the Far East, that something which I personally think would have been very good for our economy is going to be hampered by their fears that we will not be there.
Yep.
Your comments.
Yeah. The defining foreign policy initiative of this administration was referred to as the rebalancing, which was as you draw down troop strength in Central Asia, building up troop strength in Asia. Got rebranded by Hillary Clinton as the pivot to Asia. Okay. As far as I can see what the pivot has accomplished, everybody in the Middle East is convinced we're leaving. Nobody in Asia is certain that we're coming. And everybody in Europe is confused about where we're going, all right? And it's a real challenge. I think that the challenge for the United States is we are still the only global actor in any meaningful sense of that term. We have an incredibly important economic and military role in Asia. We have an incredibly important economic and military and political role in Europe. And we have an incredibly important economic, political, and military role in the Middle East. And the question is, are we going to be able to sustain that role in all 3 theaters at the same time? And right now, everybody is judging and testing whether or not we're likely to be able to sustain that role. I would say if you look at it empirically, we're not seeing a withdrawal, right? We're not drawing down our troops and bases in Bahrain. We're building up our base structure in Asia. We're not changing our patterns of engagement in Europe. We are reducing the size of our military, but that's relative to large-scale wars in Central Asia, right? So, and we don't want to be in large-scale wars in Central Asia. But there is this perceptual problem, exactly as you talked about. Now, then the trade agreement you referred to, TTP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then in the European case, the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, are as exactly as you said, I think very important signals and very important initiatives that will sort of strengthen trade relations between the Asian allies in the United States and between our European allies. It's actually striking to me when I think about it that, here are with ourselves and Europe, our closest allies for 60 years, and we haven't had a trade agreement with them. It's a free trade agreement. It's actually sort of strange. So now we're moving toward it. I don't know in Asia whether the fact that the president didn't get fast track authority will in fact torpedo the negotiations. I'm not sure that they will. Because for precisely the reason you touched on. Trade negotiations typically are exactly that. They're negotiations about trade. TTIP is not a trade negotiation. It's a strategic initiative. And Japan understands it as that. Vietnam understands it as that. Australia understands it as that. So I suspect we will see slightly greater patience on their part than they would if we were just into a trade negotiation. This is about keeping us in the region, tightening ties between us. Every step that China takes is threatening, increases their willingness to engage with us. So I could be wrong, but my guess is that we'll see more patience in this trade negotiation than we might have. And one of the real consequences, it seems to me, of Russia's moves in the Ukraine will be to solidify the TTIP negotiations for the following reasons. This is this free trade and investment partnership with Europe. One of the biggest obstacles to concluding the TTIP negotiations has been that the Europeans look at the international energy markets, our shale revolution, We pay $4 per billion BTU in natural gas. They pay 9. All right? And their argument to us has been, in effect, your shale revolution constitutes an unfair industrial subsidy. You're now able to produce goods a lot cheaper than we can because of your lower energy prices, and we're going to have to deal with that in the trade negotiations. Americans say, screw that. You know, it's a trade issue, it's not an energy issue, we're not going to get into that negotiation. And by the way, if you'd open your markets to American gas sales, you wouldn't be so dependent on Russia, and the price of gas would be lower, and you'd be better off. And the Europeans have been kind of hedging, hesitating on whether or not they want to make that bet. My guess is that one of the major consequences of the events in the Ukraine is it will reinforce those within Europe who see the logic of shifting towards opening their markets to gas sales from the United States. And we'll start to see now that'll take several years to be realized. We have to build gas terminals, we have to authorize gas terminals, they have to build gas terminals. It's a substantial investment. But my guess is that one of the major consequences of Ukraine will be to reinforce in Europe a sense that there is a good logic to shifting towards gas markets and shifting towards the United States. So on both fronts, I'm actually a little bit more optimistic than some.
Did I miss the last question here? Please.
Just a quick question. What do you think the consequences will be if President Karzai doesn't sign a status of forces agreement and all U.S. military pulls out of Afghanistan?
Yeah.
We saved that for the last question.
Yeah. No, it's a good question for a couple of reasons. One of the things I didn't talk about, but of course is an ongoing reality, are transnational threats. One of the things that's interesting about transnational threats and the Al-Qaeda phenomenon is that it's actually one of the things that most powerfully unifies the great powers. The only people who are more worried about Al-Qaeda than us are the Indians, the Chinese, and the Russians. The Russians because of their sort of Islamic Western provinces, the Indians because of Pakistan and Muslim communities, and the Chinese because of the Uyghurs. They are incredibly paranoid about Al-Qaeda. And one of the things that's striking, I'll come to the Karzai question, one of the things that's been striking over the last period of time is the extent of Russian cooperation with the United States on our role in Afghanistan. Every resupply flight into Afghanistan flies through Russian airspace. Russia is the major supplier of aviation fuel to our effort in Afghanistan. We could not be doing what we're doing in Afghanistan right now, however badly we're screwing it up. We couldn't be doing it without Russian support. I asked Putin's special envoy for Afghanistan, I asked him, I said, what's your strategy? Is your strategy to have us defeat Al-Qaeda for you, or to see NATO bleed itself dry in Afghanistan? And he looked at me and said, why not both? Okay. So we have a big interest in maintaining a capability to deal with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Russia has an interest that we continue it. Iran, I mean, everybody has the same interest here. We've put ourselves in this bizarre situation. We have legal authority to be in Afghanistan until the end of 2014. And at the end of that, we need to have a status of forces agreement with the Afghan government. Okay? Karzai doesn't want to sign this deal. Every one of the presidential candidates, there are 19 presidential candidates for the Afghan elections, every single one of them has said that they will sign the status of forces agreement. The elections will happen in the fall. But there's this ridiculous thing where, under the scenario where one of these elected candidates reneges and doesn't sign the deal, we don't have a legal authority to be there beyond 2014. It'll take us about 6 months to draw down. We can't just draw down overnight. It's a very complicated logistical operation to withdraw our forces safely. So we have to start putting in motion the withdrawal this summer. But we don't want to withdraw. We have a huge interest in staying, maintaining bases, maintaining effective bases in Afghanistan to deal with Al-Qaeda. And quite why we haven't simply extended our legal authority to be there, which we can do unilaterally until June 2015, so that we don't have to rely on the question of Karzai signing this damn thing or not. I don't know. To me, it's a very odd decision to be threatening to enact the zero option, as we call it, knowing that every single one of the other candidates will actually sign the SOFA agreement. So quite why we're playing that game, I do not know.
Thank you, sir.
Pleasure.
Thank you for all your questions. Just a quick commercial for next week. I hope you can join us next Wednesday, same time. We're going to be dealing with a related topic, international trade. Colleague Josh Meltzer will be out, and we're going to specifically look at international trade and the internet and how the flow of information across borders is an economic, national security, and global issue. And so it should be very interesting. I hope you'll have time to join us.
And Josh actually knows the difference between 5 and 6.
Great. Thank you, sir. Great. Thank you.